You really think that orange thing belongs on a marine range? The laughter rolled across the firing line before the old man ever answered. It was the kind of laughter born from confidence, loud enough to drown out common sense and young enough to believe experience had an expiration date. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Brooks folded his arms across his chest, his crisp combat utilities spotless beneath the bright Carolina sun, as he watched the elderly stranger walk slowly toward the observation area with what appeared to be the most ridiculous rifle anyone on the base had ever seen. The stock carried a faded orange finish that had long ago lost its shine beneath decades of scratches, weather, and careful hands. Against the black precision rifles lined neatly along the range, it looked almost comical. One Marine leaned toward another and whispered, "Maybe it's for deer season." Another chuckled, "Or maybe so they don't lose Grandpa in the woods." More laughter followed. The old man never reacted. Nathan Cole simply stopped beside the weathered wooden fence separating visitors from the firing positions and rested one hand lightly against the rifle's worn sling. He wore faded blue jeans, old work boots polished only by years of walking, and a plain olive jacket that looked older than most of the Marines standing within sight of it. His silver hair stirred gently beneath the breeze, but his pale blue eyes ignored every face staring back at him. They drifted instead across the valley beyond the range, following the movement of distant grass, tiny dust devils dancing over the ridgeline, and hawks circling almost invisibly against the afternoon sky. Brooks noticed the direction of the old man's gaze and smirked. "You're looking the wrong way," he called out. "Targets are downrange, not in the clouds." The younger Marines laughed again, encouraged by their gunnery sergeant's confidence. Behind them, several shooters continued struggling with the day's evaluation. The target sat nearly 2.5 miles away, positioned across layered ridges where shifting air currents had turned every firing solution into a guessing game. Laser rangefinders agreed on distance, but not wind. Ballistic computers continuously recalculated impossible corrections. Spotters argued over mirage patterns that changed every few seconds beneath the summer heat. The steel target had remained untouched all morning. Every miss echoed through the valley like another reminder that technology sometimes reached its limits before nature did. Nathan watched quietly. He didn't stare at the target. He watched the land between here and there, the slope beneath the cedar trees, the shimmer rising above dark rocks, the lazy drift of cottonwood seeds floating sideways instead of forward. Details almost nobody else seemed to notice. A young lance corporal named Noah Foster happened to glance toward him and frowned. The old man's eyes weren't wandering. They were measuring. Brooks stepped closer, his boots crunching sharply across loose gravel until he stood only a few feet away. "This isn't a museum, sir," he said, his voice carrying enough authority for everyone nearby to hear. "Active qualification is underway. Unless you're lost, I'd suggest heading back toward the parking lot." Nathan slowly turned toward him. His expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm, as though impatience had become something he had left behind decades earlier. "I'm exactly where I was asked to be," he replied, his gravel-soft voice carrying no challenge and no apology. Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Asked by who?" Nathan looked past him toward the distant ridgeline once more before answering. "Someone who's still waiting for one good shot." Nathan's answer lingered in the warm afternoon air long after the words themselves had faded. The younger Marines exchanged amused glances, each convinced the old man had offered nothing more than another mysterious line from someone who enjoyed sounding important. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Brooks gave a short laugh that carried across the firing positions. "That is a nice speech, sir. Unfortunately, speeches do not authorize civilians onto an active qualification range." He motioned casually toward the access road leading back to the visitor parking area. "You can head back that way before range control asks me why I let you wander in here." Nathan Cole nodded once, neither agreeing nor resisting. His attention drifted back toward the distant valley where the afternoon wind continued painting invisible patterns across the landscape. Tiny flashes of sunlight reflected from patches of quartz embedded in the hillsides. Heat shimmer rolled upward from dark granite outcroppings, bending the horizon into subtle waves that most eyes dismissed as ordinary distortion. Nathan watched every movement with quiet patience. Nearby, Another Marine settled behind an advanced precision rifle supported by a sophisticated bipod and rear bag. His spotter adjusted a digital weather station mounted beside the firing position, while another Marine monitored a ballistic application running on a rugged military tablet. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, air pressure. Every variable updated continuously across the glowing display. Ready, the shooter announced. The trigger broke cleanly. Seconds stretched into silence before a distant puff of dust appeared several yards left of the steel target. A collective sigh spread down the firing line. Adjust .4 mils, the spotter called. Wind changed again. Another shot. Another miss. Brooks shook his head in frustration. Reset the solution. More fingers tapped expensive screens. More numbers changed. None of them noticed Nathan quietly following a flock of small birds drifting above the canyon. He watched the way they suddenly altered direction without flapping harder. He noticed loose grass bending one way near the firing line, while distant treetops leaned another. A faint ribbon of dust rose halfway down the valley before dissolving into still air. Noah Foster noticed where the old man kept looking. At first he assumed Nathan was simply distracted. Then he realized something unusual. Nathan never looked at the target itself. His eyes remained fixed on everything between the rifle and the target. Noah swallowed quietly. Years of range training had taught him to study wind flags. The old man appeared to be studying the entire landscape. Brooks interrupted his thoughts. This exercise is designed to expose bad habits, he announced loudly for the entire firing line. Technology supports judgment. It does not replace it. If you cannot read your equipment, you fail. Nathan smiled almost invisibly at those words. Brooks caught the expression immediately. Something funny, he asked. Nathan slowly looked toward him. Your equipment is doing exactly what it was built to do, he answered softly. It is faithfully measuring the air around itself. Brooks folded his arms tighter. That is called science. Nathan nodded again. It is. His calm voice never changed. The bullet, however, does not stay here. Several Marines exchanged uncertain looks. Brooks scoffed. You planning to give us a lecture now? Nathan gently rested his hand against the faded orange stock. No. His fingers traced a long scratch running beneath the worn finish before stopping near the receiver. The valley already is. Brooks glanced at the rifle with open amusement. That old thing cannot teach anybody anything. Nathan said nothing. His thumb remained on the weathered mark in the orange finish as though recognizing an old friend's handwriting. For the first time since arriving, the warmth quietly disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a silence so deep that Noah instinctively felt he had just watched someone step backward through 40 years of memory. Nathan's thumb rested against the long scar beneath the faded orange finish, and the noisy firing line slowly dissolved into a silence that existed only inside his memory. The smell of fresh-cut grass disappeared, replaced by the damp scent of pine carried on a cold mountain wind many decades earlier. He could almost hear the rhythmic chopping of distant rotor blades echoing through narrow valleys where every second mattered and every decision depended on reading the land instead of trusting instruments that did not yet exist. The orange finish had never been chosen for appearance. It had been brushed onto the rifle during a rescue operation when low clouds swallowed landmarks and fading daylight turned every ridge into the same shade of gray. A bright stock had allowed exhausted helicopter crews to identify friendly positions from above without wasting precious minutes searching endless tree lines. Long after the mission had ended, Nathan had never painted over it. Time had faded the color, scratched it, and worn it smooth beneath countless miles of travel. But he had left every mark untouched because each one belonged to someone whose name deserved to be remembered. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived. Nathan blinked once and found himself standing beneath the warm Carolina sun again. Around him, conversations resumed as though nothing had happened. Gunnery Sergeant Brooks stepped closer, curiosity now mixing with his amusement. He pointed directly at the rifle. Tell me something. Did that color actually mean something? Or did you just think it looked different? A few Marines laughed again. One joked that maybe it helped hunters avoid losing their rifles during deer season. Another suggested it belonged in a sporting goods store instead of a military installation. Nathan simply looked at the weathered stock before answering. It helped people find their way home. His voice carried no drama, only quiet certainty. Brooks shrugged dismissively. Nice story. He reached toward the rifle without asking permission and tapped the faded orange finish with 2 fingers. Still looks ridiculous. Nathan did not pull it away. Instead, he watched Brooks with the same calm expression he had carried since arriving. There was no anger in his face, no wounded pride, only the patience of someone who had stopped worrying about proving himself many years ago. Noah Foster noticed that patience more than anything else. Every Marine he had ever known reacted to challenges with louder voices or sharper words. Nathan answered disrespect with silence, and somehow that silence felt heavier than an argument. Noah found himself studying the old rifle more carefully. It was not polished for display. It was maintained for purpose. Every screw aligned perfectly. Every edge had been cleaned without removing the marks of age. The leather sling had darkened from decades of careful handling rather than neglect. It looked less like an antique and more like a trusted tool that had simply grown old alongside its owner. Downrange, another shooter prepared for a fresh attempt. Spotters recalculated wind values while instructors adjusted firing data across multiple electronic displays. The atmosphere became increasingly tense as another expensive precision system failed to solve the invisible puzzle stretching across the valley. Brooks glanced toward the frustrated firing positions before looking back at Nathan. "You have been staring at those hills for nearly 20 minutes, he said. "What exactly are you seeing?" Nathan slowly lifted his eyes toward the distant ridgeline once more. A hawk drifted effortlessly along an invisible current before banking sharply without a single wing beat. Far below it, a ribbon of dust curled in the opposite direction. Nathan watched both movements before quietly answering. 3 different winds pretending to be one. Brooks laughed immediately. "There is one official wind reading on this range." Nathan gently shook his head. "Only where the instruments are standing." Noah followed Nathan's gaze again, and for the first time all afternoon, he stopped looking at the target completely. Instead, he began watching everything between the rifle and the steel plate, wondering if the old man had been reading a story written across the valley that nobody else had even realized was there. Nathan remained perfectly still while the murmurs drifted around him like the restless breeze crossing the range. He did not argue with Gunnery Sergeant Brooks. He did not defend the rifle. The old Marine simply watched another failed attempt unfold as the sharp crack of a precision rifle echoed across the valley. Everyone waited. Several long seconds later, another cloud of pale dust rose far beyond the steel target. A collective groan spread through the firing line. One instructor rubbed both hands across his face before turning back toward the electronic displays. The ballistic software immediately generated another correction. Wind values changed again. Elevation shifted slightly. Every screen glowed with confidence. Yet every solution continued, ending in failure. Brooks exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Reset everything," he ordered. "We run it again." Nathan quietly looked down at the orange rifle before lifting his eyes toward Brooks. "May I try?" The question was spoken so calmly that several Marines blinked before realizing what they had heard. Then laughter erupted once again, louder than before. One corporal nearly dropped his binoculars while another slapped his friend's shoulder and pointed toward the faded rifle. "You cannot be serious." Another Marine grinned. "Does that thing even have a scope from this century?" Brooks slowly turned toward Nathan, studying him with the expression of a man deciding whether someone was joking or simply unaware of reality. "Sir," he said carefully, "that target is 4,000 meters away. Some of the finest shooters on this installation have been working all day. We are using equipment that costs more than most pickup trucks." Nathan nodded politely. "I noticed." Brooks gestured toward the orange rifle. "And you believe that old rifle is somehow going to outperform all of this?" Nathan glanced toward the distant valley again before answering. "No." Brooks folded his arms. "No. The rifle only goes where it is pointed." The answer drew another wave of amused smiles. Brooks chuckled. "Well, at least you admit that." Nathan's expression never changed. "The difficult part is knowing where to point it." Noah Foster lowered the spotting scope he had been holding. Something about the old man's words refused to leave him alone. Nathan never claimed the rifle was extraordinary. He never claimed to possess impossible talent. Every answer sounded practical, almost ordinary, yet somehow carried the weight of quiet certainty. Brooks finally sighed and looked toward the range safety officer standing several yards away. This has gone far enough. He turned back toward Nathan. With all due respect, this is not a public demonstration. We cannot simply let visitors step onto a live firing line. Nathan accepted the answer with another small nod. Fair enough. He gently adjusted the rifle's worn leather sling across his shoulder as though preparing to leave. Noah unexpectedly spoke before he realized he had decided to. Gunny. Brooks looked back. What? Noah hesitated only a second. One shot would not affect the qualification schedule. Brooks stared at the young Marine. You cannot honestly be suggesting this. Noah felt several pairs of eyes settle on him. I am saying. He searched for the right words. I am curious. Brooks laughed once, short and dry. Curiosity is not a range policy. Before Noah could answer, a voice crackled through a nearby field radio requesting another status update from range control. Brooks stepped aside to respond, leaving the conversation unfinished. Nathan quietly resumed watching the valley. A hawk circled high above the ridgeline before suddenly folding one wing and gliding into an invisible current. Nathan's eyes followed every movement. Noah noticed that the old man's breathing subtly matched the rhythm of the wind itself, slow, patient, almost synchronized with the landscape. At that same moment, inside the distant operations building overlooking the training complex, a large digital display continued tracking every unsuccessful attempt made throughout the afternoon. The exercise director frowned at another failed data set, while an unnoticed diagnostic program quietly remained active in the background, waiting for a ballistic event that exceeded every expected performance threshold. No one inside the building imagined that before the day ended, that silent program would awaken for the first time in years. The range settled into an uneasy rhythm after the latest miss, but Nathan Cole remained unmoved, his attention fixed on the valley as though the conversation around him had already become part of the wind. Gunnery Sergeant Brooks finished speaking over the field radio and returned with the same impatient confidence that had defined the afternoon. Range control confirmed another relay, he announced. Nobody crosses the firing line except authorized personnel. Nathan answered with a respectful nod. Understood. He turned slightly as if preparing to leave, but before taking a single step, a sharp gust swept across the ridge. Dust lifted from one hillside while the nearest wind flag barely stirred. Nathan quietly smiled to himself. Noah Foster noticed it immediately. What is it? He asked before thinking twice. Nathan looked toward the young Marine. Instead of the valley, the wind just changed its mind. Brooks overheard the exchange and shook his head. The weather station says 3 miles per hour from the west. Nathan glanced toward the electronic masts standing beside the firing positions. Right here, he agreed. Then he pointed toward a distant ridge where sunlight shimmered above dark stone. Not over there. Brooks sighed. You keep talking about different winds like they are separate people. Nathan's pale blue eyes returned to the valley. Sometimes they are. A long silence followed. The younger Marines exchanged uncertain looks, unsure whether the old man was speaking in riddles or simply describing something they had never learned to see. Noah slowly lifted his spotting scope, not toward the target this time, but toward the ridgeline Nathan had indicated. Heat waves twisted upward in slow columns while scattered leaves drifted in opposite directions hundreds of yards apart. He lowered the scope again, puzzled. The electronic displays beside the firing line continued updating perfect measurements, yet the land itself appeared to be telling a different story. Nathan rested one hand against the faded orange stock once more. His fingers paused over the long scratch beneath the finish, and another memory quietly surfaced. Years earlier, beneath low mountain clouds and fading daylight, that same rifle had rested across his knees inside the open doorway of a rescue helicopter. Fresh orange paint still glistened against the wood, applied only hours before because another crew chief insisted the color would stand out against dark forests if the aircraft ever needed to find them again. Nobody cared whether it looked unusual. They only cared that everyone made it home. After the mission ended, one young pilot laughed and told Nathan he should repaint it before people started making jokes. Nathan had smiled, then just as he smiled now. If the color reminds somebody to look twice, he had answered, it already served its purpose. The memory faded beneath the warmth of the Carolina afternoon. Brooks noticed the old Marine studying the rifle again. You really are attached to that thing, he remarked. Nathan gently brushed a thumb across the worn finish. It has carried more memories than ammunition. Noah felt those words settle somewhere deeper than he expected. This was no collector showing off an antique. Every scratch seemed to belong to a story that mattered more than appearances. A nearby instructor suddenly called for another relay of shooters, and the firing positions shifted with renewed determination. Fresh rifles settled onto bipods. Spotters checked optics. Computers recalculated firing solutions yet again. Nathan quietly watched every movement without offering another opinion. High above the valley, the hawk returned, gliding effortlessly through invisible currents before disappearing beyond the ridgeline. Nathan followed its path until it vanished completely. Then, almost too softly for anyone to hear, he whispered, "Now the valley is finally telling the truth." Noah heard every word, and without fully understanding why, he reached for the secure field phone mounted beside the observation shack. His finger hovered above the directory card listing command contacts as an unfamiliar feeling settled over him. For the first time all day, he no longer wondered whether the old man could make the shot. He wondered who else needed to know before he did. Noah Foster stared at the secure field phone for several long seconds while the sounds of another failed relay echoed across the valley. He could still hear Nathan's quiet voice repeating in his mind. The valley is finally telling the truth. It was an odd sentence, almost poetic, yet something inside him refused to dismiss it. He had spent 3 years learning advanced marksmanship, ballistic calculations, atmospheric science, and range procedures. Everything taught him to trust data. Yet the old Marine had predicted every changing condition without touching a single instrument. Noah slowly lifted the handset. Behind him, Gunnery Sergeant Brooks continued coaching the next relay, never noticing the young Lance Corporal quietly stepping inside the small observation shelter beside the firing line. Noah closed the door just enough to soften the outside noise before dialing the operations extension printed on the laminated emergency contact card. The line connected almost immediately. Range operations. Noah swallowed. "This is Lance Corporal Noah Foster at Echo Long Range Facility." The voice on the other end remained calm. "Go ahead." Noah hesitated, suddenly aware of how unusual his report was about to sound. "There is an elderly former Marine here observing today's qualification." Silence. "Is there a problem?" Noah looked through the window toward Nathan, who still stood beside the fence with his eyes fixed on the distant hills instead of the firing line. "I do not know if there is a problem," Noah admitted honestly, "but I think someone should know he is here." Another pause followed. "Why?" Noah searched for an answer that would not sound ridiculous. "Because he has been reading wind conditions that our equipment keeps missing." The operations officer gave a polite but skeptical reply. "Former sniper?" "I do not know." "Instructor?" "I do not know." "Name?" Noah looked outside again. Nathan had not moved. "Nathan Cole." Several seconds passed with no response at all. Noah almost wondered whether the connection had dropped before the calm voice returned, noticeably quieter than before. "Spell the last name." Noah did. More silence followed, longer this time. Faint keyboard clicks echoed through the receiver. Another voice entered the background asking someone to repeat the name. Noah waited without speaking. Finally, the operations officer came back on the line. "Remain where you are. Do not interfere with the visitor. We are verifying information." The line disconnected before Noah could ask another question. He slowly lowered the handset, puzzled by the sudden change in tone. Outside, another precision rifle fired. The familiar pause followed. Once again, the steel target remained silent. Brooks rubbed the bridge of his nose and signaled another correction while frustration spread through the firing line like the afternoon heat. Nathan simply watched the valley. He seemed completely unaware that anyone had just placed a phone call about him. Inside the operations building nearly 2 miles away, a civilian analyst entered Nathan Cole's name into an archived personnel database that almost nobody used anymore. The search produced no immediate result. He expanded the parameters. Another file appeared, locked behind an older classification marker. He frowned and requested supervisor authorization. A yellow notification quietly appeared across the corner of his monitor. Legacy record access required. The analyst clicked approve after receiving the necessary clearance. Additional records began loading from long-term archives that had not been opened in years. Across the hall, another workstation automatically mirrored the query as part of a legacy notification protocol. A tiny status indicator changed from gray to amber without attracting immediate attention. Back on the range, Nathan lifted his face toward the breeze and closed his eyes for only a heartbeat. When they opened again, he looked toward the firing line for the first time that afternoon. His calm voice carried only to Noah, who had just stepped back outside. "They are almost ready now." Noah blinked. "Who?" Nathan smiled gently, without looking away from the valley. "The ones who finally asked the right question." The afternoon settled into a strange stillness that nobody could explain. Even the usual conversations along the firing line seemed quieter, replaced by the steady hum of cooling electronics and the distant rustle of wind moving across dry grass. Inside the operations building, the amber notification remained glowing on the analyst's monitor. One archive personnel file led to another. Training records, qualification reports, unit transfers. Then an older document appeared bearing a faded classification banner that required command-level review before opening. The analyst leaned closer. He had processed thousands of military records over the years, but he had never seen an archive automatically trigger the legacy notification system simply because someone searched a retired Marine's name. He reached for the internal phone. Across the installation, the call moved quickly through channels that rarely carried urgent traffic anymore. A duty officer answered. A supervisor confirmed the archive flag. Within moments, another secure line connected. Directly to headquarters. No alarms sounded. Nobody shouted. Yet experienced officers immediately recognized that an old protocol had quietly awakened. Back at the range, Gunnery Sergeant Brooks continued organizing another relay while trying to ignore the growing curiosity surrounding Nathan Cole. Several Marines had stopped joking altogether. They still believed the elderly visitor could not possibly succeed where trained marksmen had struggled all day, but something about his calm confidence no longer felt amusing. Noah Foster noticed the change in their expressions. Respect had not arrived yet, but certainty had begun to disappear. Nathan remained exactly where he had been since morning. His gaze drifted slowly across the valley before settling on the distant steel target for the first time. He watched it only briefly before returning his attention to the invisible spaces between the firing line and the mountains beyond. Brooks finally walked back toward him. His voice carried less sarcasm than before. "You really believe the conditions are different now?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "Not different." Brooks waited. "Balanced." Brooks glanced toward the weather station. Every display showed nearly identical values to those recorded half an hour earlier. Nothing changed. Nathan smiled faintly. "The instruments agree with each other now." Brooks frowned. "Is that supposed to mean something?" Nathan looked toward the hawk circling high above the canyon. "It means the air finally stopped arguing with itself." Before Brooks could respond, a military utility vehicle rolled to a stop near the observation shelter. A captain stepped out carrying a secure tablet. He spoke quietly with the range safety officer while occasionally glancing toward Nathan. Brooks noticed immediately. Captains did not usually visit long-range qualifications without a reason. The conversation lasted less than a minute before the captain approached Brooks directly. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said calmly. "Continue normal operations." Brooks nodded. "Yes, sir." The captain lowered his voice even further. "And do not ask Mr. Cole to leave." Brooks blinked. "Sir." That instruction came from headquarters. The captain offered nothing more. He simply turned toward Nathan, gave a polite nod that carried unexpected respect, and walked back to his vehicle without another explanation. Brooks stood motionless for several seconds. Headquarters had never intervened over an elderly visitor before. Noah watched the entire exchange from only a few yards away, his pulse quickening. Nathan, however, behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He gently adjusted the worn leather sling on the orange rifle and continued watching the valley with patient eyes. Far away inside headquarters, another secure message reached the office of Major General Richard Hayes. The subject line contained only 2 words. Nathan Cole. Hayes read the name once. Then he slowly stood from his desk without saying a single word. The officers around him immediately noticed the expression on his face. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The atmosphere across the range changed before anyone could explain why. Conversations became whispers. Even the steady rhythm of rifles cycling through another qualification relay seemed strangely distant beneath the low murmur of wind moving across the hills. Nathan Cole stood exactly where he had been all afternoon, one weathered hand resting lightly on the faded orange rifle, while his eyes remained fixed on the valley stretching nearly 2.5 miles beyond the firing line. He watched the drifting heat, the trembling grass, and the slow movement of a lone hawk gliding without effort through invisible currents. Nothing else seemed to matter. Several minutes later, the quiet was broken by the distant sound of approaching engines. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. Every head along the range instinctively turned toward the access road, where two dark military sport utility vehicles rolled through the security gate at a controlled pace. They stopped beside the operations shelter without dust or unnecessary noise. The doors opened almost simultaneously. Officers stepped out first, followed by Major General Richard Hayes. The conversations stopped completely. Marines who had been adjusting optics or reviewing ballistic charts straightened. Almost instinctively, Brooks blinked in disbelief. General Hayes rarely appeared without weeks of advanced scheduling, and certainly not during an ordinary qualification exercise. The general acknowledged no one as he walked forward. His pace remained measured, deliberate, almost solemn. Brooks stepped forward and rendered a sharp salute. "Good afternoon, sir." Hayes returned the salute almost absent-mindedly, without slowing. At ease. His eyes never left the elderly Marine standing quietly beyond the firing line. Noah watched every step. The distance between the general and Nathan slowly disappeared until only a few feet remained. Nobody spoke. Even the breeze seemed quieter. Nathan finally turned toward the approaching officer. Recognition appeared in his calm blue eyes before the faintest smile crossed his face. "Richard," he said softly. The general's expression changed in an instant. The authority carried across his shoulders disappeared beneath something far older and far more personal. He smiled with genuine warmth. Nathan. No rank. No title. Just a name spoken with unmistakable respect. Brooks felt his stomach tighten. He had never heard anyone address a major general so casually, nor had he ever seen a general welcome it. Hayes stopped directly before the old Marine and looked at the faded orange rifle resting against his shoulder. His eyes lingered on the worn finish and the long scratch beneath it. "You never repainted it," he observed quietly. Nathan glanced at the stock before smiling again. "It never asked me to." Hayes nodded as though that answer explained everything. He reached out slowly, not to take the rifle, but simply to rest his fingertips against the faded orange wood for a brief moment. "I remember when Captain Ellis insisted on that paint," he said with a quiet laugh. "He said nobody would ever mistake your position from the air again." Nathan's eyes drifted toward the distant mountains. He was right. A peaceful silence settled between them. Brooks looked from one man to the other, completely unable to understand the conversation unfolding before him. Noah noticed something else. The general was not studying the rifle because it was unusual. He was looking at it the way someone looks at an old family photograph. Hayes finally turned toward the Marines gathered nearby. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. "Most of you see an old rifle." He looked back at Nathan. "I see the reason an entire reconnaissance team came home on a mountain nobody expected them to leave alive." No one moved. No one spoke. The afternoon sun continued warming the valley exactly as before, yet everything about the range had changed. Brooks lowered his eyes toward the orange rifle he had mocked only hours earlier, suddenly realizing he had never actually been looking at the rifle at all. He had been standing in front of a history that quietly refused to introduce itself. The silence lingered for several long moments after Major General Richard Hayes finished speaking. No one along the firing line seemed willing to disturb it. Even Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Brooks, whose confident voice had dominated the range all afternoon, found himself standing quietly with his eyes fixed on the faded orange rifle. Nathan Cole noticed the expression and offered the faintest smile. "It is only a tool," he said gently. "People give it meaning." Hayes nodded in complete agreement before turning toward the assembled Marines. "Resume the exercise," he ordered calmly. Nobody moved. Brooks finally cleared his throat. "Sir, if Mr. Cole is willing, would you allow him one demonstration?" Hayes looked toward Nathan rather than answering himself. "That decision has never belonged to me." Nathan gazed across the valley once more. The hawk had returned, circling effortlessly above the ridgeline before disappearing into a rising current of warm air. He watched the grass ripple in 3 different directions, followed the drifting shimmer above the rocks, and listened to the quiet rhythm of leaves moving through distant trees. Then he nodded once. Brooks personally carried a shooting mat to the firing position. No one laughed anymore. Noah Foster carefully placed the spotting scope beside the firing line without saying a word. Nathan lowered himself with slow, deliberate movements that reflected age but never hesitation. He settled behind the rifle as though greeting an old friend after many years apart. There was no dramatic preparation. No complicated equipment surrounded him. He made only a few quiet adjustments before resting his cheek against the worn stock. His breathing slowed until it blended with the wind itself. Every Marine instinctively stopped moving. Even those who could not see the target understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. Nathan never looked hurried. His eyes traveled across the valley instead of locking onto the steel plate. He watched the invisible path connecting every hillside, every pocket of warm air, every gentle shift hidden between the firing line and the distant mountains. Finally, he whispered almost too softly to hear, "There you are." A single shot echoed across the landscape before fading into the afternoon sky. Then came silence. 5 seconds. 8 seconds. 10. Nobody spoke. The valley seemed impossibly still until a faint metallic ring drifted back across the distance, carried gently by the wind itself. Heads turned toward the target area. The range cameras confirmed the impact. Seconds later, the electronic scoring system refreshed. Every monitor displayed the same impossible result. At nearly 2.5 miles, the steel plate had been struck cleanly. Inside the operations building, multiple tracking systems immediately flagged the impact because its calculated trajectory exceeded the exercise prediction models. Archived legacy software quietly generated an automatic notification that was forwarded to command before anyone could disable it. Hayes smiled, not because he was surprised, but because he had expected nothing less. Brooks slowly removed his campaign cover and held it respectfully at his side. "Sir," he said quietly, looking at Nathan, "I owe you an apology." Nathan stood with the same quiet dignity he had carried since arriving that morning. "You do not owe me anything," he replied. "Just remember that experience does not always announce itself." Hayes stepped forward. "Headquarters would like to preserve that rifle in the historical collection." Nathan looked down at the faded orange stock, gently, brushing one hand across the worn finish. He smiled with peaceful gratitude before shaking his head. "History does not live inside museums alone," he said. "Sometimes it belongs beneath an open sky where someone new can learn from it." Hayes accepted the answer without another word. He came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. One by one, every Marine on the range followed until the entire firing line stood in absolute silence. Nathan returned the salute with quiet humility, lowered his hand, and turned toward the valley one last time before walking slowly toward the parking area. No applause followed him. None was needed. The only sound was the steady breeze moving across the hills, carrying with it a lesson every Marine present would remember for the rest of their lives. Respect is never earned by speaking the loudest. It is earned by living a life that allows silence to tell the story.